Evan Cole stood at the edge of the courthouse steps when they brought her forward. 20 years old, and trying to look older than the sentence they had wrapped around her. And before anyone could finish explaining why she had been chosen, he already understood what the town was doing, because he had seen this shape of justice before, the kind that dressed punishment as solution and called it order. They spoke her name like a conclusion, not a person, listing mistakes that were never proven and suspicions that had hardened into fact. And when they turned to him with the expectation of compliance, they found a widowed rancher who did not nod, did not argue, and did not step aside to accept what had been decided in his name. He listened until the words ran out, until the space they left behind made it clear the decision was meant to stand uncontested. And then he said quietly that he would not take her as punishment, that he would not be used to complete a judgment he did not agree with, and the stillness that followed landed heavier than any raised voice could have. The town had expected gratitude, or at least resignation, because they believed offering her to a man who lived alone softened the cruelty of their choice. But Evan's refusal exposed the truth beneath it, that they were not seeking resolution, but distance, a way to remove a problem without carrying it themselves. She stood beside him, eyes fixed forward, as if movement might confirm guilt. And though he did not look at her, he felt the weight of her fear in the way the crowd shifted. Unsettled by the idea that their plan required consent, it did not have. Someone reminded him of his losses, of the empty house and the work that needed doing, as if loneliness were a debt the town could repay by handing him a human consequence. And he answered only that his grief did not grant them the right to decide someone else's life. Murmurs spread quickly, irritation replacing confidence because refusal disrupted the efficiency of their judgment, forcing them to confront the cruelty they had disguised as practicality. And as voices sharpened, Evan remained where he was, calm and unmoved, making it clear that protection did not always arrive with force, but sometimes with a simple, immovable no. He told them that if she came to his ranch, it would not be as punishment or property, but by choice and under terms that preserved her dignity, and the distinction unsettled them most of all, because it stripped their decision of its finality. By the time the crowd began to argue among itself, the outcome they had arrived with no longer held, and though nothing had been resolved, something essential had shifted, the certainty that the town could decide a life without resistance. As the afternoon light stretched across the dirt street, and the discussion fractured into frustration, Evan understood that his refusal had already cost him goodwill he could not recover, and that whatever came next would be shaped by the line he had drawn without raising his voice. Choosing protection over compliance before the town could finish convincing itself it was right. The refusal did not end the matter the way the town had assumed it would, and by the next morning, Evan Cole could feel the shift in the air as clearly as a change in weather, because when a judgment was interrupted, it did not dissolve. It searched for another way to assert itself. People spoke his name with careful emphasis now, not hostile but sharpened, as if reminding him that quiet men were expected to stay in their lanes, and his decision to refuse had unsettled a balance they relied on without ever naming. She remained where they had placed her, neither sent away nor welcomed, suspended in a space made smaller by indecision, and Evan noticed how that uncertainty weighed on her more heavily than open punishment would have, because it left her exposed to every glance and unfinished thought. The town's elders met without him, framing the issue as procedure rather than defiance, discussing how order might be preserved when one man declined to carry out what had been collectively decided, and when word reached him that alternatives were being considered, he understood that refusal was only the first step in protection, not its completion. He found her later near the edge of the street where she had been told to wait, her posture still and guarded, as if movement required permission, and when he spoke to her, it was not to reassure her with promises he could not yet keep, but to tell her plainly that he would not allow the town to make another decision for her without resistance. She did not thank him, not because she was ungrateful, but because gratitude implied acceptance of the terms they had set, and instead she listened, absorbing the unfamiliar idea that someone was willing to stand in the space where authority usually pressed hardest. As the day wore on, pressure arrived in quieter forms, reminders of his obligations, of the ways cooperation smoothed life for those who lived alone, and suggestions that his refusal complicated matters better left uncomplicated. Yet none of them addressed the truth he had exposed, that the town's judgment relied on compliance to appear just. By afternoon, rumors began to circulate, recasting his refusal as stubbornness or pride, anything that made it easier to dismiss the moral line he had drawn. And Evan recognized the pattern, how resistance was reframed as disruption so that order could reclaim the narrative. He returned to his ranch before dusk, aware that distance would be interpreted as retreat, but knowing that protection sometimes required preparing for what followed, rather than remaining visible for argument's sake. From the porch, he looked back toward town, understanding that their grip would tighten before it loosened, because no system yielded quietly once challenged, and he accepted that by refusing their judgment, he had invited scrutiny not only of his actions but of his life, his past, and his losses. Somewhere behind him, the house stood silent, a reminder of what he had already endured. And as night settled, Evan prepared himself for the certainty that the town would not release its claim easily, and that protecting her would require more than refusal, demanding endurance in the face of a pressure designed to wear him down until compliance felt easier than conscience. By the third day, the town no longer treated Evan Cole's refusal as a misunderstanding, but as a challenge, and the shift was evident in the way conversations stopped when he approached, replaced by looks that measured him not as a neighbor, but as an obstacle. What had begun as a sentence meant to disappear, a problem had now exposed a deeper discomfort, because by saying no, he had forced the town to confront the fact that its judgment depended entirely on obedience to appear righteous. She felt it too, the way patience around her thinned, how politeness hardened into irritation, and how people spoke about her as if she were an unresolved task rather than a person, waiting for someone else to complete what they had started. Evan heard that some argued she should be sent away altogether, others that the original decision should be enforced regardless of his consent, and the most troubling voices suggested that his refusal itself proved he was unfit to decide, as if moral resistance disqualified him from reason. He understood then that defiance did not need to be loud to be threatening. It only needed to remain unmoved long enough to reveal how fragile authority became without compliance. When he went back into town, he did not avoid the center or take the long road around, choosing instead to move openly, not to provoke, but to make clear that he had not withdrawn his line. And though no one confronted him directly, the tension followed like a shadow. She crossed his path near the store, her expression controlled but weary, and in the brief exchange of acknowledgement between them, he sensed how much the waiting itself was costing her, because uncertainty eroded strength more quietly than punishment ever could. He told her that the town's pressure would increase before it broke, that resistance invited escalation, not resolution, and she nodded, not with fear, but with an understanding born of having already been judged without defense. By afternoon, a notice circulated calling for a formal decision, language chosen carefully to suggest fairness while preserving the original intent, and Evan recognized it as the town's attempt to reclaim authority without admitting error. He attended, standing apart as arguments unfolded around him, each framed as concern for order rather than cruelty, and when asked again whether he would reconsider, he repeated his refusal without embellishment, making it clear that compliance would not arrive through repetition. The room grew restless because certainty demanded conclusion, and his refusal denied it, forcing them to choose between acknowledging the injustice they had constructed or tightening it until it resembled resolve. As he left, Evan felt the line harden between him and the town. No longer a quiet disagreement, but a visible fracture, and he understood that his role had shifted from participant to opposition, not by ambition or anger, but by remaining unwilling to accept a judgment that treated a human life as a convenient solution, knowing that whatever followed, defiance would now define him in their eyes as clearly as refusal once had. The town attempted to reclaim control the only way it knew how, by narrowing the space Evan Cole occupied until refusal felt less like conscience and more like obstruction, and the pressure arrived not with force, but with procedure, carefully worded notices and quiet visits that framed compliance as cooperation and defiance as selfishness. They spoke of necessity, of precedent, of how decisions had to be carried out even when uncomfortable. And Evan listened without interruption, recognizing the strategy for what it was, an effort to exhaust him into agreement rather than confront the injustice he had already exposed. She was summoned again, this time under the pretense of final arrangements. And when Evan learned of it, he understood that the town intended to act whether he consented or not. Using momentum to cross a line they hoped he would hesitate to defend. He arrived before the discussion began, positioning himself beside her without announcement, a presence that disrupted their assumption that the matter could proceed quietly in his absence. The room stiffened because authority depended on the appearance of unity, and his refusal to step aside forced them to acknowledge that the judgment they were about to enforce was not uncontested. Someone reminded him that he had no claim over the outcome, that his role as a widowed rancher did not grant him veto over collective decisions, and he answered calmly that no one possessed the right to assign a human life as punishment, regardless of how many voices agreed to call it order. The distinction unsettled them because it stripped away the language they relied on to justify efficiency, leaving only the raw fact of what they were attempting to do. She stood quietly as the argument unfolded, neither pleading nor resisting, her composure reflecting a strength the town had not accounted for, and Evan realized that her restraint mirrored his own, a refusal to perform guilt or gratitude for the sake of comfort. When the discussion turned toward alternative enforcement, veiled suggestions of removal and consequence, Evan stepped forward just enough to make clear that any action taken without her consent would meet resistance, not through violence or spectacle, but through persistence and exposure, forcing the town to own its choice publicly rather than hide it behind procedure. The meeting adjourned without resolution, frustration replacing confidence, and as people filed out, Evan felt the weight of the stand he had taken settle fully into place, knowing that by refusing not just once but repeatedly, he had transformed a temporary disruption into a permanent challenge. Outside, as daylight stretched thin across the street, he understood that the town would escalate again, because systems rarely surrender authority gracefully, and that protecting her now meant standing firm against the next attempt to cross a line he had drawn, prepared to endure whatever consequence followed, rather than allow judgment to complete itself unopposed. By the fifth day, Evan Cole began to feel the cost of refusal settle into the ordinary mechanics of his life, not as open hostility, but as withdrawal, the quiet removal of cooperation that made living among others possible. Supplies arrived late or not at all, conversations shortened, and favors once exchanged without thought were suddenly unavailable, each small inconvenience serving as a reminder that protection carried a price the town was determined to collect slowly. He accepted it without complaint, understanding that pressure worked best when it pretended to be coincidence, and that responding with resentment would only allow them to recast conscience as temperament. She remained under watchful neutrality, not confined but never unobserved, and Evan noticed how the town's patience with her thinned as its frustration with him grew, because punishment sought an outlet when resistance held firm. When he passed her near the edge of the square, he saw the fatigue she tried to conceal, the strain of being suspended between outcomes while others debated her life as if time were a resource she could afford to lose. And though he could not change that uncertainty yet, he made it clear through presence alone that she was not alone in bearing it. The town council convened again, this time less concerned with resolution than with consequence, discussing how order was threatened when individuals placed personal judgment above collective decisions. And Evan understood that the conversation was no longer about her, but about him, about whether resistance itself should be discouraged to preserve authority. When he was asked to justify his stance, he did not argue innocence or appeal to sympathy, but repeated the same principle he had held from the start, that punishment without consent was not justice, and that refusing to participate in it did not create disorder, but exposed it. The response was immediate and predictable. Murmurs of irresponsibility, suggestions that his losses had clouded his reasoning, and reminders that isolation could be difficult for a man who depended on the town, all delivered with the calm concern of people who believed pressure was kinder than force. He left without engaging further, aware that debate had become another tool meant to exhaust him into retreat. And as he returned to his ranch, the silence of the house no longer felt like absence but preparation, a space that had already taught him how to endure without reassurance. That evening, word reached him that the town intended to finalize a decision soon, with or without his cooperation, and though the message was framed as inevitability, he heard the uncertainty beneath it, because systems that announced inevitability usually feared resistance more than they admitted. Standing alone on his porch as daylight faded, Evan accepted that protecting her would now require more than refusing judgment. It would demand persistence through isolation, the willingness to remain unmoved while the town tested how much he was prepared to lose. And in that acceptance, he found a steadiness that did not rely on approval, only on the quiet certainty that standing still when movement meant compliance was its own form of strength. The moment arrived quietly, the way real decisions often did, without ceremony or warning, and Evan Cole understood its weight before the town ever announced it, because pressure had reached the point where waiting no longer protected her, but slowly handed her back to the judgment he had been resisting. Word spread that a final determination would be made before week's end, framed as resolution but heavy with consequence, and Evan recognized it as the town's last attempt to reclaim authority by forcing time itself to work against him. He found her near the edge of town, where she had taken to walking in the evenings, not because it brought comfort, but because it allowed her to breathe without being watched, and for the first time, he spoke not as a shield, but as a man making an offer that carried risk. He told her that refusal alone would no longer be enough, that the town was prepared to act whether consent existed or not, and that protection now required choice, not from them, but from her. He explained what it would mean to leave with him openly, not as punishment or sentence, but as a decision made in daylight, one the town could not complete for them without revealing its cruelty outright. She listened without interruption, weighing the cost not in words but in posture, and when she asked what it would cost him, he answered honestly, telling her that he would likely lose whatever standing remained, that the town would frame his action as defiance rather than conscience, and that returning afterward might never be possible. The truth settled between them without urgency, and in that space, Evan understood that protection offered without honesty was just another form of control. She considered it longer than he expected, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned how quickly choices made under pressure could be rewritten by others. And when she finally spoke, it was to ask whether the decision would truly be hers, not a solution disguised as rescue. He told her yes, that she could refuse him as freely as she had been denied the right to refuse the town, and that whatever she chose, he would continue to oppose a judgment that treated her as consequence rather than person. The answer seemed to steady her, and when she agreed to leave with him, it was not with relief but resolve, an understanding that dignity sometimes required stepping into uncertainty rather than waiting for permission to exist. When they returned to town together the next morning, the reaction was immediate. Not outrage, but disbelief, because by choosing openly, they had disrupted the process the town relied on to enforce decisions without accountability. Evan stated plainly that she would be coming to his ranch by choice, not sentence, and that any attempt to intervene would have to be justified publicly rather than assumed quietly. And as murmurs spread, he felt the shift occur, the moment where resistance stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. In that act of deliberate movement, Evan accepted the consequences fully, knowing that by choosing protection over procedure, he had removed the town's ability to pretend it was acting for order rather than convenience. And whatever followed would no longer be hidden behind judgment, but exposed as choice. The town reacted the way it always did when control slipped from its hands, not with chaos but with correction, tightening its language and posture until defiance could be framed as misconduct rather than conscience. Evan Cole felt the shift immediately, not in raised voices but in the way authority reorganized itself around him. Meetings held without notice, decisions announced after they were already made, and his name spoken carefully, as if it now represented a problem to be managed rather than a man to be heard. By choosing openly, he had forced the town to abandon the comfort of quiet enforcement, and in response, it sought legitimacy through process, recasting his protection as disruption and his refusal as refusal of order itself. She felt the pressure, too, though it no longer rested solely on her shoulders, because now the town's frustration had found a clearer target. And Evan's presence beside her altered the narrative they preferred, one in which punishment moved invisibly and without resistance. A notice was posted citing concerns about his conduct, vague enough to sound reasonable, yet pointed enough to signal consequence, and Evan understood its purpose immediately, to make an example of him without acknowledging the injustice that required an example in the first place. People avoided meeting his eyes now, not out of anger, but caution, aware that association carried risk, and though some offered quiet gestures of support, none spoke openly because the cost of alignment had become clear. When the council finally addressed him directly, the language was restrained and procedural, emphasizing stability, precedent, and the dangers of personal judgment overriding collective decisions, and Evan listened without interruption, recognizing the strategy as the final inversion of the truth, where morality was recast as liability. He responded calmly, not defending his character or justifying his losses, but restating the same principle he had held from the beginning, that no community maintained order by assigning human lives as consequence, and that refusing to participate in such judgment was not rebellion, but responsibility. The room received his words with polite resistance, because accepting them would require dismantling more than one decision. And shortly after, a formal declaration followed, removing him from any position of influence the town could revoke, framed as necessary rather than punitive. Evan accepted it without protest, knowing that resistance at this stage would only allow the town to collapse the argument into authority rather than conscience. And as he stepped away, he felt the weight of finality settle in, not as defeat, but as confirmation. Outside, she waited, and when he told her what had been decided, she did not apologize or retreat, because the choice they had made together had already anticipated this outcome, and in her steady acceptance, Evan understood that the town's judgment had finally turned fully toward him, absorbing the cost he had refused to let it place on her. Once the town's judgment turned fully toward Evan Cole, something unexpected began to happen. Not loudly or all at once, but in the quiet spaces where certainty used to live. Because removing him did not restore order the way they had promised themselves it would. Decisions felt heavier without his compliance to steady them. Conversations grew cautious, and the confidence that had carried their punishment forward began to thin, replaced by an unease no one wanted to name. She noticed it first in the smallest ways, in how people corrected themselves mid-sentence, in how accusations softened into questions, and in how the certainty that once followed her like a shadow now hesitated before taking shape. The town had expected resolution when Evan stepped aside, believing that consequence would close the matter, but instead it exposed the hollow center of the judgment they had relied on, because without his participation, the decision no longer felt complete or justified, only enforced. Whispers spread, not defending her outright, but questioning whether the punishment had ever been necessary, whether assigning her as consequence had been order or convenience, and those questions unsettled people more than anger ever could, because they required reflection rather than reaction. The council convened again, this time with less authority in its tone, revisiting the language they had used, the assumptions they had accepted, and the ease with which they had moved from suspicion to sentence. And though no one admitted error openly, the shift was unmistakable, because certainty does not survive scrutiny once its foundation is exposed. Evan remained distant, no longer part of their discussions, and that absence worked against them, because without him to frame as defiance, the judgment stood alone, stripped of a visible adversary and forced to justify itself. She felt the change most clearly when a shopkeeper met her eyes and hesitated before turning her away, when another offered service without comment, and though these gestures were small, they marked the slow erosion of the authority that had once defined her place in the town. By evening, the narrative had begun to fracture, not replaced by apology, but weakened enough that it could no longer command agreement without resistance. And in that fracture, Evan's sacrifice found its purpose, because the cost he absorbed had removed the town's ability to pretend unanimity. Standing at the edge of his ranch that night, he understood that justice rarely arrived as vindication, but often as hesitation, the moment when a community could no longer move forward without questioning itself. And though nothing had been restored to him, something essential had shifted back toward her, not as mercy granted, but as certainty withdrawn, marking the beginning of a reckoning the town could no longer avoid. The town's decision began to unravel, not because anyone challenged it directly, but because too many people stopped carrying it forward, and without movement, judgment lost its shape and authority. What had once been spoken with certainty now required explanation. And each time someone attempted to justify what had been done to her, the reasoning sounded thinner, less convincing, as if repetition had finally exposed its emptiness. She moved through the town more freely now, not welcomed, but no longer obstructed. And that absence of resistance marked a shift deeper than apology, because it meant the judgment no longer commanded obedience. Evan Cole watched it from a distance, aware that his removal had stripped the town of its most useful defense, the ability to point to a dissenting figure and label the problem resolved through consequence. And without that outlet, the discomfort turned inward, forcing reflection where certainty once lived. The council met again, quietly and without announcement, revisiting the matter not as punishment but as process, and when the language softened enough to allow reconsideration, the outcome followed naturally, not as admission of wrongdoing, but as correction of excess. A notice was issued, rescinding the original decision, framed as adjustment rather than reversal, and though the wording avoided responsibility, the meaning was unmistakable. The town's judgment no longer stood. She received the news without celebration, because dignity restored through quiet correction still carried the weight of what had been taken. But the absence of accusation allowed her to breathe without fear, and that freedom mattered more than acknowledgement ever could. When word reached Evan, it arrived without invitation or explanation, as if the town hoped distance would absolve it of further reckoning. And though the outcome confirmed what his sacrifice had made possible, it did nothing to return what he had lost. He did not return to claim vindication or seek reconciliation, understanding that presence would only allow the town to believe the cost had been temporary, and that justice, to remain honest, required the absence that reminded them what they had demanded of him. The town adjusted awkwardly, avoiding the subject, letting the correction settle into routine without ceremony. And in that silence, the lesson embedded itself more deeply than confrontation ever could. As days passed, the story faded from open conversation, but its residue remained in hesitation, in the pause before judgment formed, in the awareness that certainty carried a price not everyone was willing to pay again. And though the town never spoke Evan's name in connection with the decision, his absence lingered like an unanswered question, shaping a boundary they would remember whenever judgment tempted them to act quickly, knowing now that some lines, once crossed, could not be restored without losing something they would never get back. The town moved on the way places always did after correcting something they preferred not to examine too closely, folding the decision into routine and allowing time to soften its edges. But for her, life did not return to what it had been, because what was taken could not simply be handed back with a quiet adjustment. Still, she walked through the streets without being measured or weighed, her name no longer attached to consequence, and that freedom, earned slowly and without apology, became the ground on which she rebuilt herself, not as someone spared, but as someone who had endured judgment and outlasted it. She chose to remain, not because the town had earned her forgiveness, but because leaving would have allowed the punishment to decide her future one last time. And in staying, she claimed something that had never truly been offered, the right to exist without explanation. People treated her carefully now, not kindly, but with restraint. The memory of how easily certainty had failed still close enough to shape behavior, and though no one spoke openly of what had happened, the absence of accusation marked a boundary that could not be crossed again without cost. Evan Cole did not return. He built his life elsewhere, quieter and smaller, without title or authority, and yet more honest than anything the town had offered him in return for compliance. He carried no bitterness, because bitterness required expectation, and he had never acted for reward, only for the certainty that some lines were not meant to be crossed, no matter how convenient crossing them appeared. In his absence, the town learned something it could not undo, that justice enforced without consent was not order, and that dignity, once defended at great cost, did not need constant protection to survive. She heard of him occasionally, always indirectly, always spoken of with a careful respect that arrived too late to matter, and though their paths no longer crossed, the choice they had made together continued to shape them both, one through absence, the other through endurance. Time passed, and the story settled into memory, not as legend or warning, but as a quiet marker of where the town had faltered and where it had been forced to stop. The truth had not healed everything, but it had drawn a boundary that remained, reminding those who remembered that judgment was easy, punishment efficient, and dignity fragile, yet resilient enough to endure when even one person refused to participate in its destruction. And though justice arrived without ceremony, and belonging came without comfort, something essential had been preserved. The understanding that refusing a wrong did not always restore what was lost, but it could prevent the loss from defining what came next. allowing dignity to stand where judgment once believed it had the right to decide. If this story mattered to you, like it, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for stories of love, redemption, and survival.